A country invades its neighbor, the world responds. Not with tanks, missiles, or soldiers, but with something far less visible. Bank accounts are frozen. Trade routes are restricted. Companies are blacklisted. Entire sectors of an economy are cut off from the global financial system. This is the modern world of economic sanctions, a tool of economic statecraft designed to pressure governments without firing a single shot. On paper, it sounds like the perfect solution. Why risk military intervention when financial sanctions can impose pain from thousands of miles? Why send troops when economic pressure can force governments to change course? For decades, sanctions have become one of the most popular foreign policy tools in the world. But there is one major problem. Economic sanctions often fail to achieve their intended goals. In many cases, they produce consequences that reach far beyond their original target, reshaping global finance, international trade, and geopolitical power in unexpected ways. The popularity of sanctions is easy to understand. They are fast to implement, politically attractive, and far less costly than military action. When a crisis erupts, governments can announce a sanctions policy almost immediately. Assets can be frozen overnight. Trade restrictions can be imposed within days. Leaders can demonstrate action without sending soldiers into combat. This makes sanctions a powerful form of coercive diplomacy, sitting somewhere between diplomatic negotiations and military conflict. For policymakers, sanctions provide a way to signal resolve, punish adversaries, and project geopolitical leverage. Yet the effectiveness of economic sanctions depends on a critical assumption. The targeted country must believe that changing its behavior will eventually lead to sanctions relief. When that belief disappears, the entire logic behind sanctions begins to break down. One of the most important examples is Iran. For years, Iran's sanctions became a central feature of US foreign policy. The goal was to pressure Tehran over its nuclear program and influence its behavior through economic pressure. Eventually, these efforts contributed to negotiations that produced the Iran nuclear deal, known as the JPOA. Many analysts viewed this as evidence that sanctions could work when combined with diplomacy. Sanctions relief was offered in exchange for policy changes, creating an incentive structure that encouraged compromise. However, when the agreement later unraveled and sanctions returned under the maximum pressure campaign, a different lesson emerged. Countries under sanctions began asking a simple question. If sanctions can return regardless of compliance, why make concessions at all? Why trust that any future agreement will provide lasting benefits? This uncertainty transformed sanctions from a temporary pressure tactic into what many governments increasingly viewed as a permanent reality. The same dynamic can be observed in Russia. Following the Ukraine conflict, sanctions against Russia imposed after the invasion of Ukraine, Moscow became the target of one of the most extensive sanctions regimes in modern history. Russian banks faced financial isolation. Russian energy sector sanctions targeted critical industries. Semiconductor sanctions restricted access to advanced technologies. Russian oil sanctions and Russian gas sanctions sought to limit the revenues supporting Russia's economy and war effort. These measures certainly created challenges. Russia experienced economic disruption, technology shortages, and long-term constraints on future industrial development. Access to advanced semiconductors became more difficult, affecting sectors ranging from defense production to industrial manufacturing. Arctic energy development projects faced serious obstacles as Western technology and expertise became unavailable. However, sanctions did not produce the immediate collapse many expected. Instead, Russia adapted. Trade patterns shifted toward new markets. Russia-China trade expanded significantly. The China-Russia partnership deepened. Alternative payment systems gained importance. New supply chains emerged. Rather than forcing complete policy reversal, sanctions encouraged a long-term strategy of sanctions resistance. This adaptation highlights one of the central weaknesses of sanctions overuse. Much like bacteria develop resistance to antibiotics, countries can develop strategies to reduce their vulnerability to future sanctions. The more frequently sanctions are used, the greater the incentive for governments to invest in sanctions-proof economies and alternative financial infrastructure. This trend is reshaping the global financial system itself. For decades, international banking systems, cross-border payments, and international trade finance depended heavily on Western-controlled financial infrastructure. The SWIFT network became the backbone of global financial messaging. Dollar dominance allowed the United States to exercise extraordinary influence over international transactions. Because so much global commerce flowed through dollar-denominated systems, U.S. Treasury sanctions carried enormous weight. Secondary sanctions extended this influence even further by forcing foreign companies to choose between access to the American market and business with sanctioned countries. This combination of financial coercion and international financial control made sanctions one of the most powerful tools in modern geopolitics. Yet this same power created powerful incentives for countries to seek alternatives. The result has been a growing movement toward de-dollarization. Countries increasingly explore local currency trade, bilateral currency settlement agreements, reserve diversification, and non-dollar transactions. The goal is not necessarily to replace the US dollar entirely. Rather, it is to reduce dependence on a system that can be weaponized through sanctions. Governments want financial independence and monetary sovereignty. They want reserve asset security and greater control over their economic futures. As sanctions become more common, de-dollarization trends continue gaining momentum. Alternative payment systems are also becoming increasingly important. The most prominent example is China's CIPS payment system, which serves as a potential alternative to traditional Western financial messaging systems. While still much smaller than SWIFT, China CIPS represents a significant step toward creating sanctions-resistant infrastructure. Countries no longer need to build systems larger than SWIFT to benefit. They simply need viable backup options. In the event of future financial sanctions or SWIFT sanctions, alternative payment networks provide an escape route. This development reflects a broader effort to create sanctions-proof finance and reduce vulnerability to international financial pressure. The rise of central bank digital currency projects adds another layer to this transformation. CBDC adoption is accelerating around the world. China's digital yuan has attracted significant attention as one of the most advanced sovereign digital currencies currently under development. Supporters argue that digital currency systems could improve efficiency and modernize digital payments infrastructure. However, from a geopolitical perspective, they also offer new opportunities to build sanctions-resistant financial networks. Digital monetary systems could potentially operate outside many traditional channels that sanctions rely upon. If these technologies continue to develop, they may fundamentally alter the future of sanctions enforcement and global financial power. These developments are contributing to a broader process of global economic fragmentation. Instead of one highly integrated financial globalization system, the world may gradually evolve into multiple competing financial blocs. A US-led financial network could coexist alongside a China-centered system and a growing collection of emerging market alliances. This shift reflects larger trends toward geopolitical competition, strategic economic rivalry, and economic decoupling. The international economic order may increasingly resemble a multipolar world order, where financial bloc competition becomes a defining feature of global affairs. Sanctions also create important humanitarian concerns. Although modern targeted sanctions are generally more precise than historical trade embargoes, they still produce significant side effects. Humanitarian consequences of sanctions often include difficulties accessing medicine, disruptions to food security, and barriers to humanitarian assistance. Banking restrictions can make it difficult for NGOs to operate effectively. Even when humanitarian exemptions exist, bank overcompliance frequently creates additional obstacles. Financial institutions often prefer avoiding all transactions involving sanctioned countries rather than risking regulatory penalties. This can produce financial exclusion that affects ordinary civilians rather than political leaders. History provides examples of both sanctions success stories and sanctions failures. Libya sanctions eventually contributed to meaningful policy changes after becoming part of a broader multilateral framework. United Nations sanctions have occasionally achieved important diplomatic objectives. Iran's nuclear negotiations demonstrated that sanctions and diplomacy can sometimes work together effectively. Yet other cases, including Iraq sanctions and various unilateral sanctions efforts, reveal the limitations of economic pressure alone. The historical record suggests that sanctions are generally most effective when they are multilateral sanctions supported by broad international cooperation, when goals are clearly defined, and when realistic pathways towards sanctions lifting exist. Ultimately, the question is not whether sanctions work or fail. The reality is more complicated. Economic sanctions remain an important foreign policy tool. They provide governments with alternatives to military intervention and offer ways to respond to international crises without resorting to armed conflict. However, sanctions also create powerful incentives for adaptation. Every new sanctions regime encourages governments to seek alternatives. Every restriction pushes countries toward financial independence. Every pressure campaign accelerates efforts to build sanctions-resistant infrastructure. Over time, these responses accumulate and reshape the global financial landscape. This is why economic sanctions often backfire. Not because they never impose costs, not because they lack influence, but because their long-term consequences frequently extend far beyond their original objectives. Sanctions intended to strengthen geopolitical leverage may simultaneously encourage the development of alternative financial systems that weaken that leverage in the future. They may accelerate de-dollarization, strengthen geopolitical blocs, promote reserve diversification, and contribute to global economic fragmentation. The very tools designed to reinforce international influence may ultimately encourage the creation of a world where that influence matters less. And as new payment systems, digital currencies, and financial networks continue to emerge, the future of sanctions and geopolitical power may depend not on who imposes restrictions, but on who controls the next generation of global finance. Economic sanctions were supposed to change the behavior of nations. Instead, they may be changing the structure of the entire world economy. From de-dollarization and alternative payment systems to digital currencies and competing financial blocs, the consequences are spreading far beyond their original targets. And if this trend continues, the future of global power may be decided not on battlefields, but in banks, payment networks, and financial infrastructure. If you enjoyed this deep dive into sanctions, global finance, and the hidden forces shaping international politics, make sure to subscribe, like the video, and turn on notifications. And until next time, keep questioning the systems that shape our world.